Bibliophiles of the internet, my name's Adriana, and today I'm here to bring you my October wrap-up. I read more in October than I expected. At the beginning of the month we had Get Graphic, which was a tremendous success, so a huge thank you to everyone who took part. I myself read 7 books from 3 different series for that event. And then because I committed to reading Own Voices Hispanic books for all of September and October, that made up for the rest of my reading month, and it was a lot. The first books I read for Get Graphic were the first 3 Avatar: The Last Airbender comics created by Brian Konietzko and Michael Dante DiMartino, written by Jean Luen Yang, and illustrated by Guri Hiru. These comics pick up exactly where the show left off, and I found myself thoroughly impressed. I feel like the adaptation to this medium doesn't skip a beat. The show itself is highly visual and there's a lot of action animation, and I was glad to see that these comics were still able to capture those moments of action and that they were still able to maintain that element of being visually dynamic. There's a lot of strategic paneling, and poses with a lot of tension were very deliberately chosen to convey and amplify those moments of action. So it feels every bit as engaging even though the images are now technically static. They don't feel that way. It feels alive on the page. The comic also brings that element of balancing high action and high stakes with a high level of emotional depth. For example, in this first arc we get a deeper understanding of Zuko's psyche, and he's already an incredibly complex and layered character. Here he's taking ownership of his own agency and recognizing that he usually turns to other people when it comes to making hard decisions because he doesn't want to take accountability if things go wrong. This series is all about evolving and reconciling past hurts with the realities of the present, and it's shown here once again in brilliant fashion. I gave these first 3 volumes respectively 5 stars, 4 stars, and 5 stars. After that, I finally completed the Chew series with volumes 11 and 12 by John Layman and Rob Guillory. Chew is about a sebopathic federal agent named Tony Chew. When he consumes things, he gets psychic impressions of everything that thing has been through. Normally, it's mildly annoying, but unfortunately in his line of work, he usually has to use this ability to solve cases, which can be fairly unpleasant. I've said it before, I'll say it until I die, but the best possible word to describe Chew is zany. The series is all over the map. It's mildly disturbing, but hilarious in such dark, twisted, and delicious ways. It's also a really compelling extended mystery, and somehow everything works. Only in Chew could you have a sequence where the main characters are being chased by a real-life T-Rex and have it make complete sense in the scheme of the series. There's crazy things happening on every page, but by the time you get to the end, it's just par for the course. But there's also not a single detail that's wasted. Everything comes back in some way. I will say the ending of Volume 12 kind of gave me pause, but then again, it wouldn't be the Chew I know and love if it wasn't just the right amount of unsettling and slightly bizarre, which it definitely was. I gave both volumes 11 and 12 5 stars. The last things I read for Get Graphic were the first 2 volumes of Boku no Hero Academia, or My Hero Academia, by Horikoshi Kohei. I should also mention that I went on to read through volume 4 by the end of the month. I actually broke my dry spell and recently posted a Manga Monday video with all my spoiler-free first impression type thoughts on this series. It's one of my favorite series to watch and read, and I'm very happy with how that video turned out, so if you want to hear me wax poetic about Boku no Hero Academia, I will link that down below. The first novel that I finished in October was one that I started at the end of September, and that was none other than The Gods of Tango by Carolina de Robertes. Once again, I posted a full spoiler-free book review for this book because it made me feel all the things. Its Own Voices queer Latinx historical fiction, and it is a gift. In terms of how it handles discovering gender and identity, it's an absolute triumph. This is one of my new all-time favorite books, and you are going to hear me reference it tirelessly for the rest of my days. Again, really happy with how that review turned out, so I will also link that one down below. Then from my library, I thought after 4 years, it was about time that I read Yaki Delgado Wants to Kick Your Ass by Meg Medina. Again, this is Own Voices Latinx YA. It's about a character named Pity who's been suddenly targeted by Yaki Delgado, a girl she's never even met. After some random girls drop by Pity's locker to tell her she's dead meat, Pity spends the next few months in fear as Yaki's attacks become progressively worse and worse. I had mixed feelings about this book because it definitely succeeds in many ways, but overall I felt that it lacked depth and focus. It succeeds in realistically showing the effects of being bullied. Pity becomes withdrawn, her grades go down because she can't focus in class, school goes from being a safe place to a living hell, and there's this helpless paranoia that everyone around you knows exactly what's going on, and they don't care. She also starts acting out, skipping school, and her fear turns into destructive behavior at times. That element I thought was done very thoughtfully, and I definitely felt for Pity as things kept building up until they eventually just exploded. There's other side storylines that, while important, just just don't seem as consequential as the main conflict. I'm thinking about the romantic element and Pity's never-ending search for her father and how she holds that resentment against her mom. Even though those things add to the scope of the story, at the end of the day, I just don't think they hold that much weight. I also didn't like how flat Yaki's characterization was. All we get about her is that she's Latina, she's angry, her family is impoverished, she's from the rough, poor side of town, she doesn't do well in school. It's just an amalgamation of stereotypes. They could have been used to unearth some kind of truth, but in the end, there was nothing compelling about her. She was just there to basically kick Pity's ass. I see what the book was trying to accomplish and I respect that, but there were parts of it that fell flat, so I gave this one 3 stars. Then I didn't plan for this to happen since it didn't fit my theme, but I ended up listening to the audiobook of How to Be a Pirate by Cressida Cowell, which is the second book in the How to Train Your Dragon series. First of all, these books are entirely different creatures than the film adaptations, but I love them for that. This series is about Hiccup Horrendous Haddock III, heir to the hairy hooligan Viking tribe. He's lanky, skinny, not the least bit scary, and he's an incredibly gentle soul, which basically means he's his father's greatest disappointment. In this installment, the young Vikings of the tribe are learning how to become proper pirates that strike fear into the hearts of their enemies, and in the process they stumble across a cursed treasure chest. These audiobooks are read by David Tennant, who honestly needs to be given every single award because there is nothing that compares to his vocal performance. His incredible Scottish inflection is wielded at full force in all its glory, and he creates unique voices for every single character that are uncannily distinctive. You will never be confused about who's speaking at any point. He also brings a great sense of dynamics and tempo to the story. He knows when to speak very slowly and softly, and he knows when to plow ahead at full speed and really sell the dramatic, action-packed moments. Like there's regular audiobook narrators, and then there's David Tennant. The story itself is hilarious and endearing. I just like how the story and the characters are so unexpected. Hiccup is so sensitive and gentle, but he's dangerously cunning, which is the exact opposite of his Viking brethren, but it's because he's different that he's able to make a difference when it counts. The series debunks this idea of masculinity and brute strength being the only kind of power. Being deliberate, careful, observant, and wickedly smart, that's an incredible power all its own, and it's going to make Hiccup a legendary Viking chief. The audiobook and the story itself are equally brilliant and unforgettable. I gave this one 4.5 stars. Penultimately, I read The Red Umbrella by Cristina Diaz Gonzalez. This story is set in 1961 Cuba, and the main character is a 14-year-old girl named Lucia. This is when Castro was just starting to come into power and take control of the country, and in the midst of all this uncertainty, her parents decide to send Lucia and her younger brother to the US by themselves. This story comes from a very valuable perspective. Lucia is at an age where she's reaching a junction in her life. On the one hand, she's impressionable and naive, processing everything that's happening in Cuba without having all the information simply because people think she can't handle it, but she's also starting to be able to make her own choices and express her own feelings about this countrywide crisis. Then when she goes to America, there's also a disconnect between the Cuba she knows and the communist Cuba that Americans fear and resent. Everyone's treating her like she's this pitiful creature who barely escaped with her life from a hateful place full of evil people, but she's like, wait, that's my family, that's my home. When she's able to have that literal distance from Castro's rule in Cuba, she's able to understand what's at stake, what it took for her parents to make the decision they did, and she's also able to realize that love and home aren't things that can be simply taken away. This was a powerful, heartfelt story, and I gave it 4 stars. Lastly, I read Versos Sencillos by José Martí. I wanted to read this poetry collection because it was mentioned twice in my reading, once in the epic fail of Arturo Zamora, which I read last month, and then again in The Red Umbrella, so it just felt like a sign. It goes from small town life in the Catskill Mountains to the peak of Martí's activism when he was instrumental in planning and executing the Cuban War of Independence, and that's how he was killed. Shout out to Manuel A. Telechea, the amazing Cuban-American writer who translated these verses. He was able to maintain the integrity of the form and its impact. Martí writes in quatrains that alternate between AB, and ABBA rhyme schemes, and Telechea is able to work that form into his translations. I love the format of this collection as well because you get to read the original verses in Spanish on the left, which for me was incredibly personal and special, and then you get to read the English translations on the right. And again, it's a wholly different experience because Telechea is creative yet faithful in his translations, but the intent and impact never wavers. Martí's verses beg to be read out loud because they're that rich and full of life, and I often read out the poems in both languages. His vision and his message are transparent. These poems are simple and clear as day, just as the title suggests, and I gave this work 5 stars. So those are all the books I read in the month of October. Like I said, there was quite a few of them, so if you have read any of these books or would like to read them yourself in the future, please feel free to share your thoughts in the comments below. But that is everything I have for this wrap up today. Thank you so much for watching this video. I really hope that you enjoyed it, and I will catch you on the flip side of the page. Bye!